Hi everyone and welcome. We are here to remember and commemorate the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, which was a deliberate famine and genocide started by Stalin to destroy the Ukrainian people, and it failed. 90 years later, the Ukrainian people still stand strong against Russia and Putin's aggression today. The Minnesota House has continually stood with the Ukrainian people. Immediately after this illegal invasion, the legislature unanimously voted to divest state funds from Russia and Belarus. Last year, we invested bonding dollars in our Ukrainian Heritage Center in Northeast Minneapolis. Now, we are sponsoring a resolution to recognize the Holodomor and recognize the last week of November as Holodomor Memorial Week, and November 28th specifically as the Holodomor Memorial Day. I should have introduced myself. My name is Sydney Jordan. I am an assistant majority leader for the Minnesota House DFL Caucus, and I represent 60A, which is Northeast Minneapolis and Southeast Como, and includes one of the largest neighborhoods of Ukrainian people in the state of Minnesota. With that, I would like to turn it over to Stefan Ivaskevich, who is a grandson of a Holodomor survivor.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am, as just introduced, Stefan Ivaskevich, and I grew up in the Twin Cities, and I am the grandson of a Holodomor survivor. The Holodomor was a 1932 to 33 Soviet engineered famine in Ukraine that killed upwards of 3 to 5 million people. In 1918 to 1922, the Bolsheviks invaded Ukraine and defeated armies that were fighting for Ukrainian independence, but Ukraine was far from pacified. Throughout the 1920s, Ukrainians resisted the occupation of their lands, and Ukrainian elites struggled against the imposition of Russian as the language of government, culture, and education. By 1932, the Soviet government had had enough and threw down the gauntlet. They executed, exiled, even drove to suicide many of Ukraine's political and cultural elite. And in the countryside, the Soviets weaponized food by imposing on farmers impossible quotas for grain and other foodstuffs. And they deported tens of thousands of the most productive farmers to other parts of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin summarized in a telegram written at the time the kind of solution this was to the problem of Ukrainian resistance. No person, no problem. My grandmother recalled the wave after wave of requisition gangs that came to their village and demanded that farmers meet their quotas. First, the gangs took their tractor and beat up her father. Next, the gangs took their other farm implements, their hogs and their horses, declaring them the property of the Soviet state. They then collected the grain, and repeated visits by requisition gangs guaranteed that nothing was left on which to survive. My Baba recalled her mother throwing herself at the foot of a soldier, begging him not to take the last of their bread. The soldier struck her on the head with the butt of his gun. The requisition gangs beat up my great-grandfather. They struck my great-grandmother on the head. The Soviet elite ordered the brutalization and starvation of millions, and the grain requisition gangs committed other atrocities, such as physical torture and rape. History repeats itself, both the good and the bad. We are currently witnessing a repetition of the savagery of the requisition gangs in the butchery and looting by Russian troops running rampant in occupied parts of Ukraine. We are witnessing the repetition of the Soviets' callous disregard for human life in the Russian Federation's indiscriminate bombing of Ukrainian cities and villages. Because history repeats itself, both the good and the bad, it is critical that students continue to learn about events such as the Holodomor. Buffered by knowledge, students will be better prepared to evaluate the benevolent claims often used when one nation attacks another. Or to put it in another context, learning about genocide and genocide studies will help future citizens of the state of Minnesota understand why renaming certain places with Native American place names is healing and important for those communities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Joe Eggers, who is the Interim Director for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota.
Thank you, Representative Jordan. Hi, my name is Joe Eggers with the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. And for 25 years, our center has balanced the role of supporting faculty and students at the university in the research related to genocide and mass violence with the need to provide resources and materials for classrooms across the state. I distinctly remember one of my first workshops and a teacher posing the question to me, "These students are in my classrooms, they've lived this story, how can I possibly teach them their history?" And I'd like to speak to two things that Minnesota has done to accomplish this. First, by recognizing the experience of communities in Minnesota, like the Holodomor, as a state, we have collectively told our neighbors that we hear your story, we recognize your pain, and we remember with you. And while these commemorations have enormous symbolic value that cannot be overstated, I'm exceedingly proud of our state's commitment to education, ensuring that remembrance in Minnesota doesn't end with a proclamation, but is instead supported by ensuring our students will learn valuable lessons from the Holodomor and make sure memory is kept alive. And if I'm not mistaken, Minnesota is the 15th state to recognize the genocide. And when we can't claim to be the first, the new state requirement for Holocaust and genocide education in our classrooms will keep Minnesota a leader in this field. I want to thank the Ukrainian community for their steadfast commitment to truth and advocacy for justice and education, and our legislators for taking the steps to recognize the horrors of the genocide in Ukraine. Together, we can continue to take the critical steps to reflect, remember, and educate. Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce Carrie Walling, who is the Director of the Human Rights Program at the University of Minnesota.
Thank you, Representative, for your support. Good afternoon. This House resolution commemorating the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor and formally recognizing it as a genocide of the Ukrainian people puts Minnesota's commitment to human rights into action. Commemorations matter for human rights protection. Denying injustices of the past renews that harm in the present, whereas openly acknowledging past human rights violations makes them less likely to recur. Human rights and genocide education are crucial in a democracy. They promote democratic principles, generate empathy, build understanding across differences, and promote respect for human rights and human dignity. This commemoration of the Holodomor contributes to the long-term prevention of other human rights abuses, and it recognizes the pain and loss of our neighbors. It matters. I urge us to not limit our actions to commemoration. We must boldly speak out against human rights violations perpetrated against the Ukrainian people by the Russian Federation today. This again includes the weaponization of food. Blocking the export of Ukrainian grain, combined with the theft of millions of tons of grain by Russia, renews fears of large-scale artificial famine in Ukraine and elsewhere. Human rights organizations have documented war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities committed by Russia's armed forces, including, but not limited to, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, unlawful killings, extrajudicial execution, torture, the cutting of electricity and water, and the unlawful forced deportation of children from occupied Ukraine to the Russian Federation. Let us stand in solidarity with Ukrainian American members of our community by remembering the past, but also by protecting human rights and democracy in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. And lastly, I would like to introduce Luda Anastevsky from the Ukrainian Center.
Thank you, Representative Jordan. I am the chair of the Minnesota Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee and the board member at the Ukrainian American Community Center. It is my honor and privilege to speak to you today. On behalf of our Minnesota Ukrainian community, I'd like to thank Representative Jordan for her sponsorship of the House resolution. We feel grateful to have a Holodomor Memorial Week and Holodomor Memorial Day in the state of Minnesota. Nothing like that happened before. Our community includes descendants of the victims and survivors of the Holodomor, as well as newly arrived Ukrainian refugees. They all bear the scars from the systemic attempts to erase our ancestors' communities, and also the most recent scars of Russia's current genocidal attempts to erase Ukrainians as a nation. The House resolution provides the recognition and justice they seek. For the first time in Minnesota history, the genocide of Ukrainians, Holodomor, will be commemorated at the state level. We are grateful to Joe Eggers, the interim director of the Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, and Dr. Walling, here with us today, the director of the Human Rights Program at the University of Minnesota, for their partnership and support in organizing this very important event. They stand in solidarity with us at this critical time as an act of justice that fulfills the obligation to educate the younger generations in a spirit of tolerance, good citizenship, and truth-telling. Today, the Holodomor genocide is recognized by over 30 countries in the world, including the United States. Last year, our Governor Waltz issued a proclamation to recognize and commemorate the Holodomor in the state of Minnesota. And it's because the Holodomor happened during 2 years, 1932 and 33, so the commemoration events are happening also during 2 years, 2022 and 2023. And today, at our event, the First Lady Gwen Waltz will present a letter from the Governor Waltz to our community of genocide survivors. And that's an act of justice, and we thank them for that too. We're also very grateful for the letters of support from Senator Amy Klobuchar and Congresswoman Betty McCollum, who've been staunch supporters of Ukraine against Russia's brutal war of aggression. In her letter, Senator Klobuchar stated, "Holodomor is a tragic reminder of the international humanitarian crisis of our past and the challenges we face today. During the genocide, mass famine was engineered by the Soviet Union that resulted in deaths of millions of Ukrainians. Today, Ukraine faces a similar crisis as Russia has engaged in an illegal, unjust, and brutal invasion and a systematic campaign of human rights abuses. This has resulted in the deaths of thousands of Ukrainians and has left many more injured or displaced. As your partner in Washington, I will continue to stand in solidarity with Ukraine and its people. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. We really appreciate your support." In her letter, the Congresswoman McCollum emphasized, "We honor the memory of those who died. 90 years later, we are all witnesses to the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian people to defeat their homes yet again. Today's event also honors the spirit of resistance to the brutal and illegal seizure of lands by aggressors. Thank you all for your advocacy and commitment to remembering the victims of the Holodomor atrocity. Acknowledging this historic trauma is critical to learning from the past and building a more peaceful world. Thank you, Representative McCollum. We really, really appreciate your support." As a granddaughter of the Holodomor survivors and a Minnesota public school teacher of over 30 years, I believe this truly is a historic moment. And so does my dear friend here, Miss Wanda Barnett, the oldest Holodomor survivor in our community. We, Wanda and I, and our Minnesota Ukrainians community welcomed the passing of earlier this year of the Omnibus Education Bill mandating genocide education in the Minnesota middle and high schools. We hope our children and grandchildren will have the opportunity to feel affirmed in their families' lived experiences, and that These are important lessons to be learned and to be taught about human rights and responsibilities, oppression, and the challenge of democracy in multi-ethnic and multicultural societies. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for being here today, and I want to especially thank Wanda for being here, and thank you to Stefan and Luda for sharing your stories and your family's stories. And I want to send a message of peace and hope to the Ukrainian people. Minnesota has not forgotten about you, and we continue to stand with you. So thank you.